Hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm Aranza Ablantes. I'm a student from the language faculty at the UABC, and I'm studying translation. And I'm going to talk about Jane Austen's biography. So let's start. Well, Jane Austen was born at Steventon Parsonage on December 16 in 1775 in Hampshire, in the UK. She was daughter of a reverend named George Austen and his wife Cassandra, whose maiden name was Lade. Reverend Austen obtained a supplement to the family income by giving private lessons to students who resided in the Austen home. Jane was the seventh of eight children and grew up in a happy and close-knit family, being she and her older sister Cassandra the only women. Cassandra and Jane were confidants. Currently, the letters that were written when they were separated are preserved, as well as those that Jane sent to other relatives. Three of Austen's siblings entered the army, giving Jane an extensive knowledge of life in the regiment, as shown in works such as Pride and Prejudice. In 1783, Jane and Cassandra went to Miss Colley's home in Southampton to pursue their education under her tutelage, but had to return because of the spread of an infectious disease in Southampton. Between 1785 and 1786, Jane and Cassandra were boarding school students in Reading, a place Jane apparently portrayed in Miss Goddard's boarding school that appears in her novel Emma. The education Austen received there constitutes all that she received outside of the family circle. On the other hand, we know that the Reverend Austen had an extensive library, and according to Jane in her letters, both she and her family were avid readers of novels, and not at all ashamed of it. So, Austen read novels by Henry Fielding and Samuel Richardson, and she also read Frances Burney. In fact, she took the title of Pride and Prejudice from a phrase by this author, belonging to her novel Cecilia. Between 1782 and 1784, the Austens did theatrical performances in Stevenson's rectory, which between 1787 and 1788 were made more elaborated thanks to the collaboration of their cousin Elisa de Fouillet, to whom Jane dedicated love and friendship. In the years after 1787, Jane wrote for the amusement of her family her Juvenilia, which includes several parodies of the literature of the time that were subsequently collected in three volumes. Between 1795 and 1799, she began to write the first versions of the novels that would later be published under the names of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Northanger Abbey, which then bore the titles of Eleanor and Mary Ann, First Impressions, and Susan, respectively. Lady Susan probably wrote around this time as well. In 1797, his father wanted to publish Pride and Prejudice, but the publisher rejected it. There is no evidence that Jane was courted by any man, aside from a slight youthful love affair with Thomas Lefroy, an Irish relative of a friend of Austen's, at the age of 20. However, in January of the following year, 1796, she wrote to her sister saying that it was all over, as he couldn't afford to marry Jane for financial reasons. Soon after, an aunt of Lefroy tried to put Jane together with the Reverend Samuel Blackall, but she was not interested. In 1800, her father decided to retire to Bath, a city that Jane didn't appreciate very much, possibly because of its hot springs. While residing in Bath, the family used to go to the coast every summer, and it was on one of these vacations that Jane met a man who fell in love with her. When they left, they decided to meet again, but he died. What we know of this story doesn't appear in any of her letters. Apparently, Cassandra referred it to her nieces, and it was not put in writing until years later. It is not known to what extent this could affect Austen, although some believe that it may have inspired her work Persuasion. On December 1802, while Jane and Cassandra were with the big family near Steventon, Harry's big wither asked Jane in marriage, and she gave her consent. However, the next day she broke off the engagement, and along with Cassandra, she hastily left to Bath. Cassandra was engaged to Thomas Fowle, who died of yellow fever in the Caribbean in 1797. Thomas Fowle didn't have enough money to marry, so the engagement had been postponed since 1794. He had gone there as a military man to get money. This may be the source of the long term rejection of some Jane Austen characters. Neither Jane nor Cassandra Austen were ever married. In 1803, Jane Austen managed to sell her novel Northanger Abbey, then titled Susan, for £10 to the Richard Crosby and Son publishing house under the pseudonym Miss Austen Dennis, although the book wouldn't be published until 14 years later. It is also possible that this was when she began to write The Watsons, although she would later abandon the idea. On January 1805, his father died, leaving his wife and daughters, who were already the only ones who remained in the house, in a situation of financial precariousness, since his income had come from his position as parish priest, and once he died, it ceased. They were financially dependent on their siblings and the small amount that Cassandra had inherited from her fiance. In 1806, they moved to Southampton, conveniently located near the Navy base at Portsmouth, allowing the sisters to see frequently their brothers Frank and Charles, who served in the Navy and both would eventually become admirals. In 1809, they moved to Shotton, near Alton and Winchester, where their brother Edward could house them in a small house within one of his estates. This house had the advantage of being in Hampshire, the same county where her childhood home was. Once installed, Jane resumed her literary activities reviewing Sense and Sensibility, which was accepted by an editor in 1810 or 1811, although the author assumed the risks. The title appeared anonymously in October, with this single annotation about its authorship by a lady. According to the diary of Fanny Knight, Austen's niece, she received a letter from Aunt Cass begging me not to mention that Aunt Jane was the author of Sense and Sensibility. It had at least two rave reviews, and Austen's profit after publication is known to have been £140. Encouraged by success, the author also tried it with Pride and Prejudice, which he sold on November 1812 and was published on January 1813. At the same time, she began work on Mansfield Park. In 1813, the identity of the author of Pride and Prejudice began to spread thanks to the popularity of the work and the indiscretion of her family. However, having sold the rights to the work for £110, she received no profit of it. That same year, the second edition of both works were published. Mansfield Park appeared on May 1814, all copies of which were sold in just 6 months, and Austen began work on Emma. In his journal, Sir Walter Scott contrasted her exquisite touch, praising the way she made commonplace things and characters interesting from the truth of the description and the sentiment. It was her brother Henry, who lived in London, who was in charge of negotiating with the publishers. When Jane went to London, she stayed at home. In 1813, Henry Austen was treated by Mr. Clark, doctor of the Prince Regent, who, upon discovering that Austen was the author of Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, works that he highly appreciated, communicated it to him and requested Henry that the author's next novel be dedicated to him, something that may not have flattered Austen, as according to one of her letters, she didn't hold a high opinion of princes because of their known infidelities. In Stratton, Austen didn't enjoy the same privacy that she had in Steventon, and the anecdote narrated by James Austen Leigh about the creaking door that Austen requested not to be repaired is quite famous, as it warned her of the arrival of a visitor with long enough in advance to hide the manuscript she was writing before someone entered the room. On December 1815, Emma was published, dedicated to the Prince Regent, and the following year a new edition of Mansfield Park. The second, however, didn't enjoy the same success as her previous works, and the loss of this second edition caused her to lose almost everything she had gained from Emma. She started Persuasion on August 1815. A year later, she began to feel ill. At the beginning of 1817, she started Sanditon but had to abandon it due to her health condition. To receive medical treatment, she was transferred to Winchester, where she passed away on July 18 in 1817. Her last words were, I want nothing but death. She was 41 years old. In her will, she bequeathed everything she had to her sister Cassandra. At that time, it was not known what had been the cause of her death, although at present it is considered to be Addison's disease. She is buried in Winchester Cathedral. Her novels Persuasion and Northanger Abbey were prepared for publication by Henry Austen and were released in late 1817 in a combined edition of 4 volumes. As in her previous novels, her name is not mentioned, although it is mentioned that she was the same author of the other works, and a biographical note on the author appears announcing her death. The epitaph in Winchester Cathedral doesn't mention that she was the author of her well known novels. In 1872, after James Edward Austen late published her memoirs, a new plaque was added explaining her status as a writer and noting, she opened her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. The only portrait of the writer considered authentic is a drawing made to illustrate the Austen late memoirs, a Victorian reinterpretation of a drawing made by her sister. It can now be seen in the National Gallery in London. From this, all the variations of Jane Austen portraits that we can find today have been created. Rich in comedy, romance, wit, and satire, Jane Austen's 6 novels are all sloping sharp reflections of her social and geographical milieu. In the British Library, also in London, you can find a notebook that her father gave her, illustrated by Cassandra, her sister, where Jane wrote her first stories. There are also manuscripts of the last 2 chapters of Persuasion, although she didn't use them later, and a small wooden desk. There are also 2 museums devoted to Jane Austen. The Jane Austen Center in Bath is a public museum located in a Georgian house on Gay Street, just a few meters before number 25, where Austen resided in 1805. Finally, the Jane Austen's House Museum, that is located in Shadden's Cottage in Hampshire, where the writer lived from 1809 to 1817. And I think it's all. Thank you very much for your attention. And any question or doubt you could have, you can contact me at my email. It's here in the poster. And again, thank you so much.